Hello, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Moore's October Rants. Today, we're diving into something that's so basic but so relevant in everyday life. It's called On the Same Page. And I bet you've been there. You know those moments where you're trying to communicate with someone, and it feels like you're speaking a totally different language. Sometimes it's at work, sometimes it's with friends, or even in relationships. This whole not being on the same page thing can pop up anywhere. And man, it can lead to so much frustration, sometimes over the tiniest stuff. Let's talk about it in a work setting to paint the picture a little clearer. Imagine you're working for a company that builds hotels, houses, casinos, basically anything that stands upright. You're part of a team, and everyone has their ideas and strengths. Now let's say you're on a new hotel project, and in your head you're thinking, let's start working on the roof area first. That's my vision for it. But your colleagues? They're over here talking about starting with the foundation. And honestly, both approaches make sense in their own ways. But since no one's on the same page, suddenly there's this clash. Not because anyone's wrong, but because everyone has a different idea of what getting it done looks like. When you think about it, a lot of conflicts come from this exact thing. It's not always about being right or wrong. It's just that people are sometimes looking at the same project or goal from totally different angles. And if no one communicates that, it can feel like a tug of war. I'm not saying everyone has to agree 100% on everything, but sometimes just understanding where someone else is coming from can make a huge difference. That's all we're really talking about here. Seeing things from each other's perspective to get the vibe going in the same direction. And this idea isn't just about work. It's everywhere. Friendships, family gatherings, and even casual conversations, if we're not in sync, it can feel uncomfortable, and suddenly the conversation doesn't flow. It's like hitting speed bumps over them, but here's the thing, and I'm big on this. Just because you're not seeing eye to eye doesn't mean you can't get along. We're human after all, and differences are what make us unique. So when you're not on the same page with someone, it doesn't mean you have to burn bridges or cut people out. Sometimes just sitting back and listening can actually help clear things up. And if you've been with me since the early days, you might remember one of my first rants. I talked about how just because someone disagrees with you, it doesn't make them your enemy. And I still feel that way. Look, just because I have a different take on something doesn't mean I'm out here trying to start a fight. Disagreement is a part of life, and it's actually what makes conversations interesting. Take politics, for example, because that's one area where people really tend to divide. Maybe you disagree with someone on one big issue, but say you've got 25 other things in common. Is it worth throwing out a friendship or relationship over that one disagreement? Probably not, right? And yet, you see people do this all the time. They find one thing to disagree on, and it's like everything else just doesn't count anymore. It's a negative way to look at things, honestly. You don't need to be on the same page about everything to get along with someone. That's not how real relationships work. In fact, those differences can make things richer if you're willing to keep an open mind. But sadly, not everyone thinks this way, and that's where things get toxic. Miscommunication or a minor disagreement can become this big, unnecessary mess if we're not willing to look past it. And it's the same thing in romantic relationships. Now here's where things get even more intense because, let's face it, you're spending so much time with this person that any lack of alignment can feel pretty magnified. There's this guy I follow, Terry Joel Jr., who shares a lot of advice on self-improvement and relationships. One thing he talked about was how, when he was dating, he'd often find himself with people who weren't on the same path. He was focused on self-growth, working out, building himself up, and trying to create a positive life. But sometimes the person he was with was focused on completely different things, maybe things that didn't really align with his priorities. Think about how that can affect a relationship over time. When one person's all about self-improvement, and the other's on a different track, it's hard to meet in the middle. It's almost like you're living in two separate realities under one roof. And it's not that one person's right and the other's wrong. They're just on different pages. and that can be hard to reconcile if neither one is willing to shift a little to find common ground. And that's really what this rant boils down to. I'm not saying we all need to be clones of each other or that we should agree on every single thing. That's just not realistic. But finding some common ground where it counts can make all the difference in a relationship, friendship, or even just a day-to-day interaction with someone you barely know. You don't have to see things exactly the same way, but at least respect each other's viewpoint enough to make things go smoothly. If you can find that middle ground, it's way easier to get along, even if you don't agree on everything. At the end of the day, that's really the beauty of open dialogue. Not everyone is going to agree with what I'm saying here, and that's totally fine. You're free to agree, disagree, or find your own interpretation of it. That's the beauty of having different experiences and perspectives, and it's why these conversations are worth having in the first place. So, anyway, that's my take on being on the same page. It's not about agreeing with everyone, but about respecting the differences enough to make things work. Thanks for sticking around and listening to another episode of Moore's October Rants. Signing out. Have a good one. Goodbye.